Hi everyone, and welcome to today's talk about publishing, which is part of a series of roundtables on the publishing system in academia, which is a collaboration between Animal Behavior Live and the University of Sussex, which funded this series of roundtables. So today we're very happy to welcome Fernando Racimo, who is an associate professor at the Global Institute at the University of Copenhagen. He was previously a postdoctoral research associate at the Pickrell Lab at the New York Genome Center, and he did his PhD in integrative biology at UC Berkeley, and also worked at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. His current research interests involve developing tests to detect patterns of ancient selection and creating methods to integrate functional and population genomic data. But today he is going to talk about ethical publishing and has published a paper entitled Ethical Publishing, How Do We Get There?, which was published in 2022 in Philosophy, Theory and Practice in Biology. So I guess today Fernando is going to develop this line of thought about facilitating ethical publishing and pushing it further through collective action and degrowing academia. So the floor is yours, Fernando.
Thank you so much, Natasha, and thanks to Animal Behavior Live for the invitation. Yes, as Natasha mentioned, I'll be talking about facilitating ethical publishing through collective action. And usually when I give this talk, that's sort of the full title, but increasingly, and as I hope to convince you, I'm seeing that a lot of the issues related to ethical or unethical publishing in academia have to do with deeper structural issues in academia that go beyond just publishing. So I've added this like little parenthesis about degrowing academia, which I'll develop this idea towards the second half of the talk. But before I start, I just want to sort of talk about my positionality, where I'm coming from, just to explain maybe what my privileges are within academia and what maybe potential blind spots that I might not be seeing as I talk throughout this talk. So I'm a white male, heterosexual, European descended man. I come from a relatively privileged socioeconomic background. My salary falls within the global top 10%, and I'm in a relatively stable academic position in the global north. I'm originally from what is now known as Argentina. I was born into what is originally Carandí land in ABL, Latin America. And so this informs my perspectives about academia in general. A lot of what I'll be talking about has to do with this paper that Natasha mentioned that was published in PTP Bio a couple of years ago. It's called Ethical Publishing, How Do We Get There? It's a joint collaboration with a wonderful team of people who really want to push for ethical publishing in scientific and scholarly systems. Nicolas, Veronique, Noemi, Ben, Thomas, and Denis. You can find the paper in PTP Bio. It's also available as a preprint in Zenodo and OpenIRE. And so I usually start this talk by asking the audience how much they think a scientific paper costs. And I'm just going to use one example of a fairly high-profile journal within my own field in ecology and evolution, Nature, Ecology and Evolution. And to answer this question, I think it's important to understand the cost to whom. So who's paying for an article to be published? And so if we think about what the cost to an author is of publishing in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, and we imagine that author wants to publish open access, the latest number for this, so how much an author would have to pay to publish open access in this journal, is $12,298. That's more than my monthly salary, and I believe it's probably more than the monthly salary of almost every academic in the world, with perhaps a few exceptions. But this is what it costs to publish open access in this journal. And now one might think that perhaps the author may not have the means or might not want to publish, pay as much to publish in this journal. There is still the option in this journal to publish via paywall. So the cost is now on the reader whenever the reader wants to access this paper. You can buy this article for about 40 euros, or you can subscribe to the journal yearly for yearly subscription of about 120 euros. But then perhaps you might want to ask yourself, how much does it cost for the journal to publish an article? And of course, Nature, Ecology, and Evolution doesn't release these numbers, but there have been several estimates made in the literature about how much it costs to publish a paper, to the editing, the proofreading, the dissemination, and it varies depending on, the amount of reach that you might want to give a paper and the particular type of formatting, but it's somewhere in the order of between 30 and 300 euros. So you can already see that already with perhaps one person buying this article, maybe as much as 10, the journal is already recouping the costs of publishing a paper in this journal. And then the question might be, well, how did we get to this crazy situation where articles cost so much to be published in these particular journals? And I think it's worth going over a bit of the history of scientific and scholarly publish, because I think the history informs the current state of the situation today. So if we go back a few decades and we think about sort of traditional society publishing, so when articles were published by societies of scholars or scientists, the way this would work is a scientist would receive some money broadly from society, perhaps back then through state support, increasingly through maybe private foundations. Then the scientist puts some of the money that that person, he or they have received from broadly society into the manuscript, the resources that go into research, buying microscopes, buying the cost of sequencing, of observing the things that you might be observing in the world. And then the person also puts their own labor into this, right? So there is some labor that goes into producing scientific work. We are workers after all. Then that manuscript goes through peer review, and then another scientist gives away their own free labor to do the peer review. Then it gets put on a paywall, and the paywall is there so that readers who want to access that article provide some money to the society, and so that money might help with journal costs, so copy editing, the dissemination of the journal, but also with society costs, perhaps paying for conferences, grant schemes that the society might be interested in running. This is increasingly not the way that journals work. There's a very, very nice paper, now it's about 10 years old, but the trends have continued. It's published by Larry Gear et al. It's called The Oligopoly of Academic Publishing. And it shows that societies have been increasingly sold their capacity to produce articles to these big conglomerates, these big corporations of publishing, so that now the publishing landscape is increasingly dominated by just a few mega publishing corporations. And this has led to an increased process of commodification and commercialization of research, where now the money that circulates, that is provided by readers and scientists, is not just about producing research, but perhaps producing a profit from somebody else. And so this model of traditional society publishing has been increasingly replaced by another model called for-profit publishing, where a lot of the money from the paywalls is actually going to shareholders, so people that hold shares of these corporations and are expected to receive ever increasing amounts of money from the investment that they make in these corporations. With the process of journal digitalization, so the advent of the internet, all these online tools that have made publishing more of a thing that you do while looking at your computer rather than while you read a physical piece of paper. What has happened is that journal costs have dramatically decreased. It actually costs a lot less now to produce a journal, to produce a paper, than it did in the 70s or in the 60s. But that doesn't mean that the money going from readers into these corporations has decreased as well. What has happened is that more of the money has been obtained by shareholders. So the reduced production costs have been absorbed by capital holders, so by those who are investing in these corporations. There have been open access schemes that have been proliferating since the early 2000s. One of the most popular one is this one called Gold Open Access. In this one, the money going into the shareholders and to journal costs remains roughly the same. The difference is that rather than the readers paying to access the journal, what happens now is that the scientist pays some amount of money for the article to become open access. And essentially that just means that broadly society is paying for the cost of open access. So perhaps state funding institutions, perhaps private foundations are paying for the open access costs that are being absorbed by these corporations. And there has been an increasing process by which these costs of open access have risen a lot. So what has happened is that shareholders have derived more and more profits from this scheme, and that essentially means that the price of publishing open access has risen dramatically, and that's where we end up with a $12,000 price for an article in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. Scientific publishing is a highly profitable endeavor. I highly recommend that anybody in the audience who can become a CEO of one of these corporations really consider whether that might be a career option, because really these corporations are making huge profit margins. Elsevier has 37% profits, Taylor France 39%, NPG 27%, much larger profits than other major corporations like Amazon or Google. So it's really profitable to be in the scientific publishing business right now. And the reason for this is there's a lot of free labor and free resources coming into the system from academics and broadly from society, and very few costs. This happens even as some of these journals, like for example NPG, are underpaying their own workers. So this year there were acts of strike by the Nature Publishing Group, like calling for fair pay. So it looks like a lot of the money that is being absorbed by these corporations is not really going to the workers of these corporations, but to the shareholders and perhaps the executives. What this process has led to is an increasing drainage of funds from academia, from libraries, from public institutions. The spending that has been done on journals over the last few decades has greatly outpaced standard rates of inflation in the global north. This is because libraries have to pay increasingly larger and larger amounts of money in order to be able to access this research through paywalls, and because academics are also having to pay larger and larger amounts of money for obtaining open access deals. There are alternatives to this system. One that I particularly like is called the Diamond Open Access System. And under this system, readers don't pay anything to access the article, and scientists don't pay anything. What happens here is that the scientist is bypassed as the one that is supposed to provide money to the journal. The journal runs not for profit, so there are no shareholders, and the money goes to the production of the journal and the articles. And this is usually funded directly from public and sometimes private institutions that put money into these journals to ensure that they're both free to publish and free to read. And this sort of breaks the dependency on the scientist as the one that is being encouraged to pay ever and very large amounts of money. Some of these domain open access journals are associated with societies, so this doesn't preclude that a society might obtain some of the money that might come from running some of these journals for perhaps running conference costs or grants. One of the most famous diamond open access systems is the PCI and the PCJ systems, with which I'm particularly associated. I'm in the managing boards of one of these systems. So I'll explain what these are briefly. Basically, the PCI system, or peer community in system, is a system by which peer review happens independently of publishing. So basically, you just submit a preprint to any approved open access repository of preprints like bioRxiv, like SciArchive, like Archive, Zenodo, and then there's a process of peer review, and then the preprint itself might be recommended by a colleague in the same way that in a normal publishing scheme, an editor might either approve or reject a manuscript based on peer reviews. But the important thing here is that the recommendation, the peer review process, happens independently of the act of publishing. And now after the article is recommended, after the peer review process is finished, the author might choose to take the preprint together with the peer reviews and perhaps submit this to a journal that is that plays well with the peer community system. There's a lot of journals that are now associated with the system. And a nice thing is that the author need not do that. You can just directly submit your preprint plus your peer reviews and recommendation to the sister system to the PCI, which is called the Peer Community Journal. So this is a proper journal that is indexed in journal databases, like any journal. It's a diamond open access journal, so you don't really pay anything for submitting your peer-reviewed manuscript there. And it's guaranteed to be published if it's been recommended previously by the PCI system. So if you've gone through the peer review process and you don't want to submit it to another journal, you can just submit it directly to the PCJ journal, and you'll get it automatically approved and published. I think it's a really nice system that I highly recommend everybody in the audience to try. It's not the only system, so Peer Community Journal and the PCIs, the different thematic PCIs, are a big part of this diamond open access ecosystem, but there's many other diamond open access schemes out there in various fields, in psychology, in statistics, in biology, in ecology. And I'm putting some examples in the screen here. And the question is, if the system exists by which authors don't have to pay, readers don't have to pay, it's fairly hassle-free. I've tried it many times. It's a fairly nice process to go through because you're not really putting a dime and you're ensuring that everybody will get access to your paper. Why would we want this gold open access model instead, by which scientists put a lot of money into journals like Nature, Ecology, and Evolution? And I think many of us might know the answer to that is prestige, right? A lot of these journals are not really just journals. They're marks of prestige. They're sort of gold badges, gold stars that we can put in our CVs, and that might increase our chances of getting the next job, which in academia, that might be particularly hard given the hyper competition that exists in academia today. Because of that the fact that this is not really just a journal, but also a mark of prestige, this is why journals like these are able to ramp up their prices so much, because really a prestige label is not associated with the cost of anything. A prestige label can have an arbitrary price, as high of a price as you're willing to go to obtain that prestige. And that explains why precariously employed scientists are under huge pressures to obtain these prestige badges, and that's why these journals are able to ramp up their prices so much. The prestige hierarchy exists in academia. We all know about this. There's particular journals that are prestigious and particular journals that are less prestigious. This is an entirely made-up system. It exists because we believe it exists, but if tomorrow we woke up and we suddenly did not believe it exists, it would cease to exist. It's sort of a system that is collectively recreated every day. It's advantageous to these commercial conglomerates. So there's an advantage for these conglomerates to maintain the appearance that some journals are more prestigious than others, even though the peer reviewers might be the same for the prestigious and not prestigious journals. A way to maintain this collective illusion that we're in is by something called prot-speak language. This language has been seeping into academia over the last few decades, by which we're constantly encouraged to publish in impactful, excellent, top authoritative venues that sort of elevate us above the rest. And this ensures that some journals are higher than others, even though the only thing that makes them higher is the belief that they're higher. And this leads me into sort of a wider problem in academia today, beyond just publishing schemes and diamond open access versus gold open access schemes. There's a wider problems in academia today associated with the fact that the rush to publish in a lot of these prestigious journals is because, as we all know, in academia, there's a strong competition for a small set of grants, a small set of jobs, stable jobs that we're all trying to get. There's increasingly, less funding, fewer jobs, given the number of people that are being that are trying to get to these jobs. And so what this means is, because there's strong competition, there has to be some metric, or it has been decided that there has to be some metric to judge that competition that we're in, and that's these marks of prestige, the scientific performance metrics, these stupid numbers that we like to circulate, like your H index, your impact factor, and that's what drives the increase to spend more and more to obtain these marks of prestige. Kayal et al. Has a very nice paper about this, published in 2022, almost the same time as our ethical publishing paper. It's a really nice complement to what we're saying. I highly recommend read on this one. Now, what I'd like to argue is that this system, this academic system that we're in, by which there's job scarcity, but that job scarcity is largely artificial. It has happened through the increasing precarization of academic positions, through the expansion of postdoc as a category that sort of drives a lot of the labor in academia, as well as other precarious and temporary jobs, temporary lecturers, temporary research positions. There's also an aspect of metrics and managers serving a logic of infinite growth. These are what scientific performance metrics are. There's the consequent overproduction that happens as we are encouraged to produce more and more in ever higher, more prestigious journals. And eventually that feeds the process of capital accumulation. This whole system is not specific to academia. Academia is not special. There's a lot of systems today that are going through the same processes of artificial job scarcity, precarization, obsession with metrics, obsession with managers that are evaluating those metrics, that are telling us perhaps you're underperforming and you need to do more, you need to publish more. And all of this is serving this logic of capital accumulation. So there's nothing really special about academia. It is a capital accumulation system. It's a capital system that is designed for those who hold capital, the shareholders, for example, in commercial journals, to absorb more and more money and labor as much as possible, as much as they can. And I think this is, to me, I think this is a really important point, that we academics are not somehow different than a lot of other workers that are going through similar processes. Similar processes are happening, for example, in the healthcare system, increasingly privatized, increasingly driven by metrics, increasingly doctors and nurses being pushed to do extra work. It's also happening in the food provisioning systems, in a lot of systems in our society today. This infinite growth imperative is not just affecting publishing. It's not just about publishing more and more. We also see this imperative in other aspects of academia. For example, the imperative that universities have to create more societal value or to be more profitable. There's an imperative on managers to compete in university rankings, so who can get higher in these rankings. There's an imperative for institutes, research centers to do better on these metrics. There is an imperative on individual researchers to have higher H indices. There's an imperative on all employees to go up the academic ladder, sort of compete with your colleagues to get to these coveted stable positions. There's an imperative on teachers and researchers to compete for ever scarcer permanent positions, for ever fewer but perhaps more concentrated grants, to publish more and better, as I've mentioned, for research to somehow be portable to capital and industry, and for students to constantly compete to each other. There's a really good book about this. It's called What Are Universities For? By Stefan Kolini. It talks about all these different imperatives that have become prevalent in universities today. Another aspect of the system that I mentioned that is intimately linked to overproduction is labor precarization, this artificial scarcity of jobs by which universities are increasingly run by people who are constantly fearing for their jobs, constantly fearing that in a couple of years they will not be able to have a salary. In Switzerland, for example, this is one statistic. Postdocs make a huge proportion of the academic workforce, which didn't used to be the case just a few decades ago. This artificial scarcity and overproduction is mediated by managers. So people that are tasked with evaluating what people are doing through these metrics and checking that production is happening at higher and higher amounts. This is a cartoon, I think it's from Australia, by which a member of the top class is sort of trying to scare a worker into thinking that the problems of this worker have to do with migrants or precarized migrant workers. And this applies to a lot of systems in capitalist society today, where we have sort of a managerial class, managers constantly overlooking our jobs. We have semi-stable workers who might fear for their jobs, and we have temporary, precarized, or a huge unemployed workforce that is trying to get to the semi-stable positions. And so these two classes are pitched against each other so that the managerial overclass continues to accumulate more and more. And this can easily be transferred to academia. We have rectors, deans, provosts, professional board members, line managers as this managerial overclass, professors, lecturers who have these sort of stable, semi-stable positions, and the more temporary lecturers, postdocs, interns, and student researchers who don't even have the advantage of stability. Isabel Stengers talks about the fact that the system is affecting our psyche, it's affecting our psychology, and it's making us sort of ever more depressed inside. And I'm just going to read this quote from her that under constant surveillance and pressure, scientists have effectively been cut off from whatever it was they cared about. Think about like the reasons why they started to become scientists in the first place. And so they're either reduced to the suddenness we call depression, or end up as the kind of opportunistic cynics who know how to make all the right moves, how to publish high and strong. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is not just about open access, it's about labor precarity, this logics of growth and capital accumulation, it's about manufactured prestige. It's also about climate collapse. This is might be a bit of a surprise, but some of these commercial conglomerates have deep ties to the fossil fuel industry and are helping to drive climate breakdown. There was an article by The Guardian just a few years ago showing how Elsevier, one of these big commercial publishers, has all these ties to the fossil fuel industry that is currently driving us towards climate disaster. And there's also a follow-up article by the Union of Concerned Scientists listing all the ways in which, for example, Elsevier and its parent company Relics provide support and help to the fossil fuel industry. That is through research and development services, data services to oil, gas, and coal companies, through lobbying and financial support for politicians who block climate action, by disseminated information intended to help companies produce more fossil fuels through journals that are specifically dedicated for extraction of fossil fuels, by removing barriers to exploring and operating in emerging markets, and by hosting fossil fuel industry exhibitions. Some of these journals host also databases that these fossil fuel companies use to figure out where it is best to drill around the world. And then this has been sort of maybe the depressing side of the talk, but I don't want to just sound depressing. I want to talk a little bit about what else we could do, how academia could look like in a system that is not geared towards capital accumulation, and perhaps that is more just and geared towards the well-being of its members and generally the well-being of society. And so I'd like to talk about degrowing academia. I'm going to borrow some of the concepts from the emergent scholarship of degrowth and talk about an academia where, rather than having precarious or artificially scarce positions, we have secure means of subsistence, a system in which, rather than metrics and managers constantly surveilling us, we have well-being and cooperation at the core of the system, and where we're not constantly encouraged to produce ever larger amounts of scientific output. So we have something like a concept of slow science, where we take some more time to think and act before we overproduce. How can we do? What can we do to get there? There's a lot we can do, but almost everything that we can do can fall under this label. We can organize for change. We can coordinate efforts across academia to push for change together and to empower our positions. And before I sort of list some of the things that could be done, I just want to say, we're all embedded in these scientific and academic systems, in these logics of growth. I'm very much guilty at some point in my career for being geared towards publishing in a lot of these journals, for trying to climb the academic ladder. And I'd like to say, that doesn't preclude us from talking about things that could be different. If anything, it should encourage us to think about what could be different. Just because, society is a little bit shitty right now, that doesn't mean that we can think of how we can get to a better state in society. So here's a non-exhaustive list of initiatives in no particular order as to how we can change our academic systems towards a degrown academia. There are institutional initiatives. For example, there's the Plan S, an action plan for diamond open access, for encouraging researchers to go through the diamond open access pathway. The CNRS also encouraged scientists to stop paying to be published, to pursue some of these time and open access policies. Max Planck Institute also has issued communiques, promoting time and open access in research activities. There's also more bottom-up things that can be done. One of the things that I really like is PCI Manifesto, so the peer community system and the members of the system, which are just academics that are doing this mostly on their free time. They drafted this manifesto that said basically, if a certain number of people sign, and I think it was something like 500 people, if 500 people sign this manifesto, then we're all committed, we'll commit ourselves to publishing our next article in the peer community journal, this time and open access journal. And so this ensures that it's not just you that is going alone and publishing in one of these journals. You're ensuring that the people around you are also committing as well, and so it's easier to do this if you see other people doing it as well. It's sort of like sending a collective signal. And this, I think, is a screenshot that I took a few weeks ago, but this surpassed. I think we got like more than double the number of signatures that the manifesto was expecting. 1,125 people signed this manifesto, and this means that for each of these persons, there will be one more article that's going to go through a system that is not geared towards capital accumulation. We can also try to look at the weak points in the systems that are exploiting us. So, for example, peer review, which, as I said, it's just free labor that is being given by scientists. On good faith, because we want our colleagues also, in many cases, want our colleagues to succeed. We want to help them. We want to help their science. We want to make sure that their science is good. And so we provide free labor through peer review. But this is also a way in which journals exploit our labor. So there's been many calls for refusing to peer review for commercial journals. Often this is done publicly. You don't have to talk about the person that you're refusing to peer review for, or even the editor that requested it, but you're sort of publicly sending a signal that I'm not going to review for this particular journal, and you list the reasons why you're doing it. I've done it several times on Twitter, where I received a peer review request from one of these commercial journals, and I published my reply that I was not going to do it because these journals were absorbing huge amounts of money from academia and society in general. And other people have done this as well. Now, it's important to explain the reasons and to perhaps even, you can offer to the authors to peer review for free if the authors decide to go through another venue. The idea is to try to not put the authors in a difficult position, while also signaling to others that it's just not okay to support the systems for free. You can also refuse to submit, say, I'm not going to contribute to submit into this journal. Sometimes you can, be a bit problematic if you're in a consortium, and you're a group of researchers. Perhaps you haven't put that much work. You've put some work. You could say, I'm not gonna include my author name into this journal, into this paper, if it goes through this journal. And maybe it's just a little bit of labor that you're sacrificing, but it sends a huge signal to everybody that is in the consortium to maybe reconsider why they were choosing to publish in that venue, and if it really means sacrificing one of the authors in order to do that. There's template emails that have been developed. A lot of the work for refusing to peer review and refusing to publish is the work of this campaign called Stop Elsevier, especially geared towards the fact that Elsevier promotes climate breakdown through its ties to fossil fuels. I encourage you to check out this website. Has a lot of information, a lot of helpful information about how to navigate the complications of disengaging from these commercial publishers and helping to keep fossil fuels out of our research. Some journals have completely decided to disengage through publishers by quitting and creating something else. So, for example, this journal Lingua, the entire board of editors of this journal Lingua, they were scientists working in linguistics, decided to abandon this journal, which was published through Elsevier, and create their own diamond open access journal called Glossa, that follow a lot more ethical principles than Lingua was following. There's big news about this a few years ago. But this is not the only example. There's many cases of journal editor boards deciding to sort of issue a declaration of independence from commercial publishers, which you can find in the open access directory, and I'm putting the link there. This is another journal that follows sort of ethical principles of publishing. actually publishes about degrowth. It's called the Degrowth Journal. And I think it has a nice phrase that sort of summarizes what this is about. A journal is like a community garden, and there is no community garden without gardeners. That's where you come in. So really, journals are the things that we make them to be, and we're putting a huge amount of our labor, not just in the publishing and the peer reviewing, but also in the coordination of the editing and copy editing. So I think it's important to consider, whether what's coming out of that is actually going to benefit society or not. We can also try to tackle another weak point of the system, which is this prestige hierarchy, this made-up hierarchy that exists and is perpetuated every day because we constantly use these words like impact, excellence, top, authoritative to distinguish some journals or some ways of doing science from others. And we can topple down the pyramid by having conversations, coffee conversations with people in our departments, in our institutes, where we talk about journals like Cell, journals like Nature as profiteering, exploitative, outrageous, money draining, associating bad words to these journals rather than these marks of prestige. So making them less of a prestige badge and maybe more of something to be ashamed of rather than something to be proud of. There's also direct action and civil disobedience. This is a particular favor of mine. I'm a member of a civil disobedience group called Scientist Rebellion. There's a sister group to Scientist Rebellion called Scientists for Extinction Rebellion in the UK. And what they did is they did a rally right in front of the shareholder meeting of RELX, which is the parent company of Elsevier, calling attention to the fact that RELX and Elsevier had all these ties to the fossil fuel industry, were promoting climate collapse, and they were using their identity as scientists, wearing lab coats to call attention to this outrageous behavior by this commercial conglomerate. One of the scientists for XR, Caroline Vincent, actually bought a single share of RELX in order to be able to sit at the meeting and kind of interrupt the meeting and call attention to the ties between the fossil fuel industry and RELX. There's a YouTube video about this. There's also an emerging climate rights coalition of various NGO and various academic groups that are coming together, and they are advancing a human rights grievance mechanism in the UN, linking Elsevier's ties to the fossil fuel industry to human rights violations through the major humanitarian crisis that is being caused by climate breakdown around the world today. So I guess hopefully I've convinced you that there's a lot we can do to advance ethical publishing, but it's not just about ethical publishing, and actually tackling any part of the system helps to get us away from the logics of infinite growth and capital accumulation, be that through tackling the logics of overproduction, things like having open access systems, the logics of artificial scarcity, or the logics of metrics. In terms of the logics of artificial scarcity of jobs, for example, we can demand fair pay, end to precarization. There's been a lot of union work being done, for example, in the UK in this picture, to demand fair pay and an end to precarization in academia. So stable jobs that are paid what they should be paid. And this only happens if people rise up and actually pose resistance. We can also ask our academic institutions to cut ties with fossil fuels. For example, the example I gave about Elsevier. There's also many universities that have ties to fossil fuels. This one, for example, is Erasmus University in the Netherlands. It has many ties to I think it was Shell, and it was occupied by students and staff a couple of years ago, calling for the divestment from fossil fuel corporations. I think it was the director of this university ended up calling the police on its own students, which caused a huge media storm and brought attention to this issue. In my own country, where I work in Denmark, there's a very famous institute that helps infuse fossil fuel research and development called DTU Offshore. It's a university called DTU, and I was again a couple of years ago was involved in an action with Scientist Rebellion where we built a mock pipeline made of cardboard in the central yard of this university. We started digging into their campus, and that brought the attention of the university director, brought the attention of the media. It caused a bit of a stir, again using our scientific identity to push for change. And we can also push for change not just because of fossil fuel ties. There's also other ways in which the capitalist logics of the university today are helping to make the world worse. For example, by supporting genocide. This is a picture of a Palestinian encampment in my university, University of Copenhagen, that happened earlier this year and led to the university divesting from corporations that were supporting the occupation of Palestine. We can also think about envisioning and building alternatives to the current academic system. So we can do work inside our universities, but also think about what other types of knowledge production and sharing systems there could be out there. And I think indigenous and decolonial scholars have done a lot of work in this regard. I really encourage to visit the Ecoversity's webpage. There's a lot of examples of sort of alternative ways of organizing knowledge production and sharing, reclaiming knowledge, designing new ways of doing these things in a way that sort of promotes ethics of care and trust. Also engaging with social movements and local communities in the places where these ecoversities exist. Along these lines, I'm also involved in this thing called the Movement for Free Academia, which is particularly strong in the Nordic countries. We recently published this Gothenburg Manifesto of how we could envision academic systems under an ethics of care, away from managerialism, away from these logics of infinite growth. So I'll end my talk with some literature recommendations, some papers that I really recommend if you're interested in some of these topics. Obviously, check out the ethical publishing paper and how do we get there. As I said, it's available in PTP Bio. It's a Diamond Open Access journal, so it's free for you to read. If you want to think about moving away from the logics of overproduction and thinking of overproduction as academic success, there's a really good paper by Uray and Kelly in eLife about rethinking academia in a time of climate crisis, about sort of putting us back within sort of this academic donut where we're not overshooting, we're not sort of pushing towards over competition, over commercialization, metric fixation, but at the same time, we're ensuring that we have academic freedom, stable jobs, diversity, equality, and inclusion in science. I also have a paper together with several scientist activists that's called the Biospheric Emergency Calls for Scientists to Change Tactics, about maybe changing the things that we consider to be conventional academic behaviors in academia today. Sort of academics today, the first thing we think about when we think of academic outputs is publishing, it's papers, but that's not the only thing we could be doing. There's other things we could be doing, including engaging in advocacy, activism, civil resistance, interrupting our curricula to talk about some of these difficult issues, promoting interdisciplinary dialogue with indigenous peoples, regenerative research practices, supporting activism through our science. So I'll talk about, together with several of my scientist activist colleagues, I talk about this in this paper. We can also think about democratizing our academic system. So, moving towards academic systems where everybody has a voice and the university is democratically run by those who actually make it run every day. There's a quote from this paper by McKeown and Barry. So it says, if they are to contribute to societal transformation, universities must undergo transformations that explicitly and systematically reorient academic practices around social and ecological protection and priorities. Along similar lines, there's this other paper by Missen Martel, and I think this was my favorite paper to read this past year. It's called For Democratic Governance of Universities, the Case for Administrative Abolition. I think it has the best first sentence of an abstract that I've ever read in my entire life. It says, in this essay, we argue for administrative abolition, that is, the elimination of all college presidents, provosts, deans, and other top-level administrators, who we argue form a parasitical group that was developed over time in order to exercise both political and financial control over faculty, staff, and students. So it talks about models of governance that exist in university today and alternative modes of governance that existed in the past and that exist in other countries that involve a lot more participation by students, by staff, by faculty in the everyday running of universities. So take-home message, the conclusion that I'd like to transmit is that ethical publishing is something to be desired, something to be strived towards, but it's not just about open science. It's not just about making our science available to the public. It's about a lot more than that. Overproduction, artificial scarcity, and competition are natural consequences of the system driven by capitalist growth logics. And there are other academic systems that are possible, and some of which are being born today. And it's our task to maybe try to support them and nourish them as they struggle to be born. There's a lot we can do in this regard. First of all, talking honestly with our peers about the systems in which we're all embedded and the problems with those systems, finding a collective action group or movement. There's a ton of groups, both within and outside academia, that are trying to initiate change in different ways. So finding the group that you think is worth supporting and actually providing some of your time and energy towards it. And essentially challenging and especially helping others challenge existing logics and structures of power, finding where we hold power and maybe where we can relinquish it. Again, I'm saying this from a position of relative privilege in academia. I have a stable job, but I am surrounded by people that don't have stable jobs, that are precarious, and I would like that to change. I would like the people around me are also feeling the same level of stability as I do. So if I had to sort of summarize my talk in one word, it would be organize. We are in turbulent times, and the more we organize, the better we'll be able to navigate these times. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Fernando. That was engaging for sure, and I hope it will inspire people as much as it inspired me the first time I listened to your talk with PCI. We're waiting for questions. There is always a little bit of delay between the YouTube live and us. So, of course, I am a postdoc, and I'm sure you've been asked this question a million times, and maybe you have examples of how you deal with this as someone who has a permanent position, because there is, as a postdoc, I feel the pressure to publish the more I can and in the most prestigious journals I can. That's not me putting this pressure on myself. That's what people tell me when I'm trying to apply for things. And of course, there is this feedback loop where my PI then needs to publish a lot and in these prestigious journals because we are collaborators on this research. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's a question that I get often, and I think we talk about this in the ethical publishing paper. One of the we did a few analysis in that paper, and one of the things that we showed, I think this is something that should be followed with more extensive analysis, is that when you look at people in different stages of academia, and here we were only able to include stable positions, so I'll talk about the more precarious positions in a second. But when you look at sort of the advancement from assistant professor to associate professor to full professor, we looked at a bunch of institutes, and what we saw is that the people that were more successful, that were not, it was not statistically significant relationship between being successful and being highly cited by whatever conventional metric you want to use, and choosing to publish in commercial journals. And that doesn't mean that commercial journals, again, don't provide these marks of prestige. As I said, they do, but there isn't a strong relationship between this career success, at least once you get to a particularly stable position. And the question is getting to a stable position. Maybe there is a big difference, but I think that's something that it's worth exploring. And more importantly, I think it's something worth conversing among the people that have a lot of power and the people that don't have a lot of power. So I'm going to use the example of my own lab. I would never, tell a person, especially a person that has less power than I do within academia, a postdoc in my group or a PhD student, not to publish in a commercial journal. But I do talk about the problems with commercial journals, right? And I talk about the fact that they're exploitative, that they're profiteering. And what has happened is that a lot of my students have come to me and without me sort of pushing them in any way, have come to me and said, I want to publish my manuscript in PCI or PCJ. And I mean, this has happened in a lot of cases. There's a lot of articles that are being published in PCI and PCJ by people that are not, senior academics as first authors, whereas they're students and postdocs. I think we shouldn't undermine the fact that a lot of the motivation of people that are in precarious positions is not just about climbing up, but it might also be about trying to make the system better for everybody, right? And there's obviously sort of an equilibrium there. Maybe you're not a complete altruist, but I think sometimes we underestimate how much people want to collectively change the systems that they're in. We just think of people as completely driven by success and competition as the only motivation that they have. And to me, there's been a lot of surprises in my lab where I thought, this person was going to choose a commercial publishing venue, and they ended up choosing a non-commercial publishing venue. And I think this also drives the prestige of these venues. I think now PCI and PCJ have a lot more prestige than they used to have a few years ago. And so, yeah, having those conversations, just talking about, rather than say, you should publish here because it's going to help you and it's going to help me in my career. Having maybe journal clubs where we talk about the problems with these journals without actually making sort of normative statements, but just talking about the underlying logics of the systems. I think that sort of elevates the consciousness of people, and it will make people act more altruistically, more collectively. So I think conversing about this is absolutely important. Somewhat related to this, this is one of the reasons I'm excited about collective action, particularly today. I started in my department this folder where we all put our pay slips. We can sort of remove our names from the pay slips if we want. So like we remove the name from the payslip, but this allows us to see, how much each person is earning within an academic department. And I just recently learned that somebody looked at this folder and they compared themselves to somebody that had sort of a very similar job and experience and was actually earning a lot less. And so they complained to HR about this, and they actually got a higher salary than they had before they even knew about this. So just sharing information within departments, within research centers is absolutely crucial. A lot of the ways in which power perpetuates itself is by withholding information. And so the more information there is shared, the better it is, I think.
And do you think conversation is enough to change mentalities for people who sit in panel members, the ones that are actually evaluating our applications when we are looking for permanent positions?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's enough. At the same time, I do see that there are big changes being made. For example, in France, there's now there's now a directive. I think if you're doing evaluation in a CNRS panel, you're not supposed to look like, I think the journal names are deleted from the CVs. So I think there's work happening along these lines to sort of prevent these power inequalities reproducing themselves in panel applications. But I absolutely agree that the more responsibility you have is those who have the most power, right? So like the more power you have in the system, more responsibility you have to try to change it. And again, I've been often pleasantly surprised by people who were fairly up in the academic ladder and trying to sort of change the ways in which the power they acquired was obtained. At the same time, there are also people that are quite happy with acquiring more and more power, even once they've acquired a ton of power. So I'm not saying everybody's a saint, but I think even having these conversations might allow you to identify allies within departments and see who you might want to talk to moving forwards.
We have our first questions in the chat. So from Danny Garside saying, I really enjoyed how you linked academic publishing to wider economic philosophy. What do you think a non-capitalistic academia might look like until we reach UBI, which I personally don't know what it stands for.
Right. I think he means, or they mean universal basic income. So this is a degrowth policy, a proposed policy by which, our means of subsistence, our ability to obtain food and shelter and health are not determined by our salaries, but everybody gets a minimum salary that allows you to survive. I mean, if you want to work more and get extra, you can, but like this sort of separates our ability to continue living in the system from providing labor to the system. I think it's a good question. One of the things we should absolutely do is push for policies like UBI, both in academia and more broadly. But I also understand that we're not there yet. If we had UBI, then academia would look obviously very different. Maybe academia would be more of a hobby that people do, and so maybe the people that would be in academia would also be very different from those that are in academia today. So it might look very different. There are, and here I'm using sort of some existing initiatives. I'm borrowing now from like these ecoversities initiatives, from alternative academic systems that exist, particularly in the global south, where sort of people self-organize in a way that goes beyond just academia. So, you might have small communities where there's a focus on learning, on producing knowledge, but there's also a focus on growing food together, or doing work that benefits the whole community together. So that's sort of like maybe an eco-anarchist vision where we're all sort of self-organizing in our little own eco communities and trying to maybe learn about something while we're not dependent on the broad capitalist system. But we can also try to change the big structures of power. And I think a lot of the work being done for this, a lot of the challenges that are coming from this is like there's a lot of student groups, also academic groups that are challenging a lot of the ways in which the university is run, these managerial structures of power. And I think talking to unions is super important. Maybe thinking about whether the sole purpose of academic unions is just to focus on salary levels. Maybe there's broader work that can be done with unions to think about an equivalent to UBI in academia, or thinking about unions pushing for alternative democratic structures in academia, moving away from rectors and line managers. Revitalizing unions is absolutely important. Unions are not what they used to be, at least in the global, not what they used to be in the 60s and 70s. In my own country, in Argentina, in the early 20th century, for example, there was a big push for student governance in universities, and some of that still remains in the university system in Argentina today. Students have a lot more power than they do in Europe in terms of running how the university, and that was through student revolts, through students occupying places, through political action within the university. I think that's something that should be rescued. So I think there's kind of two tracks to this, and I was recently in a workshop where we were discussing these tracks. There's sort of what salvaging we can do of the existing systems, and a lot of that has to be about trying to change the structures that we're in, but there's also seeding, creating new systems outside of what currently exists.
All right, thank you. So I think some people in our team at Animal Behavior Lab had some questions as well. In particular, Marco Bravic was asking, in some developing countries, there is still a struggle to incentivize high quality research. One way to motivate was rewarding publishing in prestigious journals. If this is gone, how will the governing body evaluate the quality of research? The capacity to directly evaluate the quality of research is limited in such a small community due to the lack of capacity and funding, conflicts of interest, and personal intolerance.
Yeah, I think, thanks for the question. I think I want to evaluate what we mean by the quality of research. Like when I read a paper and I evaluate its quality, I'm not really looking at the journal name. Often I see quite a lot of trash being published in journals like Nature or Cell. It's the quality of the research is, how well is the research done. And I think the problem here is that we sort of fix so much on the goals rather than the sort of the overall thing that we want to create, that the goals sort of become the dictators in the system. I would like to move to a academic system where high quality research is research that is not just maybe statistically rigorous, but also involves care work. And I think indigenous research communities are doing a lot of work in this that is respectful of the world that is being studied. And I think none of this goes into the evaluation of whether an article goes into a journal like Nature or not. So I think that the important thing is, one, thinking about what we really mean when we mean high quality research, and whether high quality research is currently well defined, and why we're being pushed to produce ever quantities of what we call now high quality research, which essentially means research in a high quality journal, which is a journal that was sort of primed on us to be considered as high quality. So really reevaluating the very basic categories of what we're trying to do when we're working in academia. And of course, like again, this goes to broader questions of like academia in the global south, which is a lot more strapped for money due to patterns of colonialism and imperialism that are still present in the global south today, why those are, and how can we break from them. And it's also work that can be done in the global north to think about why universities in the global south are sort of seen as somehow less than universities in the global north, when often they're doing much better work than the universities in the global north.
Okay, maybe one last question and then we wrap up. So from the chat, Alexis Buatois, who also is in Animal Behavior Live, is asking, what about preprint? Could it be a start point towards a free system, for instance, by transferring our review work on this platform instead? Yeah,
I think that's a great idea. I think there's been some experimentation with that. I think, you know, if I were to redesign a system, and if we weren't under the logics to produce ever larger quantities of research, there wouldn't be such a thing as a journal, right? So there would be preprints, and there would be people commenting on those preprints, and maybe people would read the preprint and the comments and the peer review, and that would be the activity of reading other people's research, right? Like the sort of the name journal is also in itself somehow a mark of prestige, and it's kind of funny because there's sort of like the peer community journal, which is just, you know, an automatic acceptance of anything that is recommended by the peer community initiative, was started after the peer community initiative because people were asking, but can we just name it journal? And I was doing this myself. Can we just add the word journal there so that, you know, I can talk to the people around me and say I published this in a journal? And so that's also like a collective signal that we're all like under the collective illusion that the word journal somehow changes the thing that we're making to something else. So absolutely, you know, if as we move towards better academic systems, I think we need to reevaluate what it is that we do when we produce scientific output. Also moving beyond sort of even preprints, right? You know, thinking about research in other ways, you know, like scientific outputs in other modes, like, you know, the results of my scientific work stated in the form of art, for example, or moving away from the particular textual conventions that have come to define the scientific article today, where you have to have the intro, the methods, the results, the conclusion, and they have to be stated in a particularly dry, emotionally free language. Experimenting with all that are all things we could be doing, but we're not, because we're sort of constrained by this logic of increasing overproduction and under very tight constraints of what we think scientific output really is.
All right, well, thank you again, Fernando, for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and I hope everyone did. I would like to thank again the Research Knowledge Seed Fund for funding this series on the publishing system. And a reminder to our audience that we have our last seminar of the year on Tuesday, August 27th, with Manjari Jain, if I'm pronouncing this correctly, talking about cricket communication. Thank you very much.